Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Feel free to move down if you'd like to. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to this year's Erasmus lecture sponsored by the English department. I know most of you, but I don't know all of you, so let me just introduce myself briefly. I'm Sherry Larson-Heckley. I chair the English department this semester, and I'm also co-coordinator of the Gender Studies program. This lecture comes to you with the good work of the English department, some happy work on the ground and collaboration from all of my colleagues, especially Sarah Skripsky in coordinating with us. We are also grateful to the Addie Institute for much that they have done to make this happen, and particularly to Aaron Sizer for publicity, for coordinating, for being sure everything is in place, including the people who will be here to record this lecture so that when your friends are sorry they weren't here, be sure you have them check the Addie Institute website, and it will be up as soon as we have a chance to put Dr. Hughes' lecture or slides in with the lecture so that you'll be able to see some of the images she's working with today. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce our speaker and then turn things over. Dr. Linda Hughes is the Addie Levy Professor of Literature at Texas Christian University. Linda, I'll put this back down for you, but I'm going to try to stop dancing with it. There we go. Throughout her career, her research has focused on Victorian literature, on gender studies, on print culture, and recently on transnationalism. And we'll get some tastes of that broad and varied work today, I think. Her specific publication record recently, very recently in its length, is an indication of her active mind, I think. And so I wanted to just share a few titles with you from the last 5 years. A book, A Feminist Reader, Feminist Thought from Sappho to Satrapy, from Cambridge in 2011, and with Sharon Harris. Also Teaching Transatlanticism, edited with Sarah Robbins in 2015. And a 4-volume encyclopedia of Victorian literature, which is very exciting for those of us who are Victorianists, edited with Dina Faluga and Pamela Gilbert. And also in the last 5 years, the Cambridge Introduction to Victorian Poetry. Okay. Dr. Hughes' CV is as long as that 5-year window might indicate and is rich in that time. But let me just give you a couple other indications of who we might hear from today besides what she works on. She has been TCU's Graduate Faculty Member of the Year, not 1, but 3 times. She's also received support from her research on multiple occasions from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And her work's been acknowledged by professional associations in our field, like the 18th and 19th century British Women Writers Association, and also by the North American Victorian Studies Association, and also by the research, the Victorian Society for Research Periodicals. Okay, it's my field and I forgot that one. She's also won her own university's Chancellor's Medal for Distinguished Research and Creative Work. Okay? And distinguished research and creative work are certainly going to mark what we hear today. There's one other trait as you look at Dr. Hughes' CV that I found for her unusual, and that is the number of times that she has worked collaboratively with her other colleagues. And that skill, I think, that character trait of working in community is part of what had those of us who know her work excited about bringing her to campus so that we could hear from her. And in just the short interactions that I've had with her in getting ready for this talk today have indicated that she is someone who brings out good thinking in other people and seems to really enjoy thinking through her ideas with other people, a kind of voracious curiosity that's also infectious. So I'm excited for how that's going to come out in the talk that we hear today, which is titled Prefiguring Future Pasts, Imagined Histories in Victorian Poetic-Graphic Texts from 1860 to 1910. Please welcome me, join me in welcoming Dr. Hughes.
Thank you, Sherry, so much for that lovely introduction. And in fact, thank you for inviting me to be here today. I consider it such an honor to be giving the Erasmus Society lecture here. I also want to give special thanks to Sarah Yoder-Skripsky, whom I had the pleasure of working with at TCU and who I'm so happy to see here today and during my visit. But I've enjoyed meeting many of you already, and thank you for coming. So I wanted to say a little bit first about where this talk came from. This is a kind of one-off piece. It's not part of a larger project, although it does reflect my larger interest, first of all, in treating poetry not as an elite form cut off from others and available only to a few. I'm really interested in poetry conceived as an intrinsic part of a wider culture, which it was in the Victorian era because so much of the poetry circulated in the pages of Victorian periodicals, which had wide readerships. Christina Rossetti had 20,000 readers for many of her first poems when they appeared in Milton's magazine, for example. So it represents that interest. It also represents a kind of interest in visuality and poetry and their interaction. I am not an expert in comics or the graphic novel. I do have one at home, but I'm still waiting to read it. It is part of a book collection that is forthcoming entitled Drawing on the Victorians, the Palimpsest, a Victorian and Neo-Victorian graphic text. But I had a student who was fascinated by comics and the graphic novel who taught me a lot about it and how to think about it. I also taught a seminar on the Victorian novel and its afterlives, and that kind of introduced me to Neo-Victorianism, which you will also see reflected here. Finally, this talk grows out of some of my past teaching experience, including a graduate seminar on the medieval revival in the Victorian era, which I am so pleased to say Dr. Scripsey took when she was at TCU. It was a wonderful class. A final little comment about my term here, poetic-graphic text. The customary term is simply illustrated poetry, but that kind of, does in the argument about its relationship to the graphic arts or to the graphic novel from the outset, because it kind of, here's a text and then we're going to add an illustration. Instead, I'm arguing that these that I am going to be looking at have a hybrid text in which both the verbal and the visual parts are inextricably tied. So that's why I decided I needed a different term, the poetic-graphic text. And even in my notes, I don't cite it by author, I cite it by title, and then list the text author, the drawing author, and the engraver whenever possible. So that's the background. Now I'm going to get right to it. Rather than approaching illustrations as interpretation of text, I underscore the inseparability of word and image in hybrid text, a perspective essential to graphic fiction and comics and their theorization. Poetic-graphic texts, in fact, more firmly link text and image than the more familiar Victorian illustrated serial fiction. Whereas in shilling part format, two illustrations at the front are offset by a succession of text-only pages, poetic-graphic texts often appear on a single page and rarely exceed 5 pages. So text always has an intimate proximity to image. Moreover, because poetry is compressed and surrounded by white space, words themselves are visual, as in comics and graphic novels. Another key feature of comics and graphic novels applies to poetic graphic texts as well. The coming together of past, present, and future on the page. And like comics and graphic novels, poetic graphic texts in periodicals are readily aligned with popular culture and seriality. The sheer number of poetic graphic texts in periodicals also indicate their significance. An initial search of just one database, ProQuest's British periodicals, returned 20,151 hits for the period when I paired search terms poems and illustrations from 1860, when the golden age of periodical illustration was bolstered by new illustrated family magazines, through the end of the Edwardian period in 1910. Many hits represent satiric comic poems, editorials, or jokes, more than complex hybrid visual verbal texts. When photographs, mere headpieces, and tailpiece designs or unrelated poems and image juxtaposed on pages are eliminated from these hits, a significant number of poetic graphic texts remains. Within them, one group has special relevance to neo-Victorianism. As Paul Goldman and Simon Cook observe of Golden Age illustration in books and magazines from 1855 to 1875, its most common subjects were domesticity and medievalism. The medieval revival in literature and art had been ongoing at least since 1765, when Thomas Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry appeared, and encompassed high and popular culture, since medieval legends still clung to topography, as at Glastonbury, and Gothic churches were familiar sights. After the French Revolution's destruction of an ancien regime, medievalism also acquired new British associations with unbroken tradition and national identity. Hence, the significance of the Gothic style for the new Parliament buildings after the fire of 1834 destroyed St. Stephen's. By mid-century, Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, which I was happy to hear in the class today, some of you know, had inspired pre-Raphaelite illustration in the 1857 Moxon edition of his poems, an image from which you're going to see later. And his Idylls of the King quickened the vogue of medievalism in poetry after 1859. The Golden Age illustrations noted by Goldman and Cook were, of course, not medieval, but neo-medieval, highly self-conscious because they necessarily shuttled among known historical details, legends, and an imagined recreated past that, when disseminated by new technologies of high-speed printing and reproduction, also announced their own modernity. Neo-medievalism became a mobile graphic and verbal idiom that could serve divergent aesthetic, social, and political ends while captivating wide audiences. Victorian poetic graphic texts in a neo-medieval register thus formed the prehistory, I want to argue, of neo-Victorian graphic texts, since both look back to a past they revise and recirculate in a modern idiom. Many also anticipate features of modern comics. In what follows, I sample important precedents from a single database while also attending to specifically Victorian constructs in their negotiation of gender and medieval iconography. To establish a frame of reference, I briefly discuss, I'm sorry, I'm having to look over and above my mic as I read, so please forgive me as my head bounces about. I briefly discuss contested masculinities in 3 examples from the 1860s. These clarify the degree to which representations of a fantasized past illuminated middle-class masculine ideals versus their violation, while nonetheless allowing for freer exploration of gender roles than was possible in a realist idiom. These examples also reveal nascent visual techniques that would become more fully developed in modern comics and graphic novels. More striking anticipations of modern comics and graphic novels occurred in poetic graphic representations of women in the 1860s, perhaps not surprisingly, since neo-medieval fantasy permitted artists and poets to register some implications of contemporary changes in women's education and women's increasingly activist roles in society. And it also enabled them to experiment visually. In turning from 1860s Golden Age texts to later decades, I trace anticipations of neo-Victorianism itself, whether in terms of inventive visuality, interrogatory critique, or mobilization of conservative nostalgia. As an instance of Victorian conservative, even imperial content paired with graphic techniques that adumbrate comics' temporal complexity, I begin with King Sigurd the Crusader, first published in Good Words in December 1862. The 1860s poetic graphic texts I located mention the Crusades more often than King Arthur, perhaps because Crusaders' religious warrant for appropriating lands abroad suited audience after Britain began direct rule of India following the 1857 rebellion. The text of King Sigurd the Crusader celebrates the valor, patriotism, and fidelity of its title character, who vows not to marry until he has won a claim in the Crusades. En route, he meets the, quote, Paynim foe and corsairs of brown Barbary, then is victorious in Palestine, firmly resisting the beautiful maidens of Jerusalem because, quote, the maids of all the world are not like those of home. The king's steady gaze and strong verticals of Sigurd and his beloved Hinda in Edward Burne-Jones's illustration, in contrast to the attendant women's sorrow, forecast Sigurd's victories abroad and his moral steadfastness. The design depicts the king's departure, but incorporates a past, present, and implied future, since it doubles as an image of Sigurd's return, when his fidelity to God, country, and beloved, like his chivalric prowess, are confirmed, and the sorrowing maidens become the bride's wedding attendants. In Faint Heart Never Won, Fair Lady, in Once a Week, in July 1863, nothing could be further from normative masculinity than the visual image that dominates the second page. It shows a dandified, mustachioed courtier in elaborately embroidered tunic, a yo-yo, or a bandolier to Victorians, dangling from his right arm, his left hand raised in meditative introspection to his lips, while his lyre and hoops lie off to the side. An intriguing anticipation, for those of you who know this operetta, of Bunthorne, the comical, high aesthetic poet in Gilbert and Sullivan's satirical 1881 operetta, Patience. From the gaudy flowers on the suitor's tunic to his effeminate stance and coiffure. His toys, and that's actually a word in the poetic text itself, suggest the playthings of adolescence rather than the achievements of manhood. And the woman he courts stands with her back to him, a baffled or rueful expression on her face. The text, a dialogue, opens with the lady declaring that if her suitor won't fight rebels at the gate, she will. But gender norms are quickly reinstated once he speaks. It needs not I should prowess learn from any lady fair. And the poem ends with their own future past, when their children and grandchildren recall his valor and her wifely support. If the text teaches what belongs to masculinity, the image introduces an alternative and calls norms into question, since the effeminate dandy and the valorous warrior on the field inhabit the same person. Insofar as the Poetic-Graphic text fissures masculine identity and interrogates simultaneously a past and current gender ideology, Faint Heart anticipates the back and forth of time frames and multivalent significance of much neo-Victorianism. Ballad of the Page and the King's Daughter, and I'm going to talk about the text for a little bit first. Inspired by a German ballad of Emanuel Geibel, provides yet another perspective on 1860s masculinities by introducing issues of class and male tyranny. Excuse me. In the poem, the king, objecting to the lowly status of the handsome page with whom his daughter has fallen in love, kills the page and throws his body into the sea, where it is found by mermen who fashion a harp from the gleaming body white as snow. On the day the princess dutifully prepares to marry a prince selected by her father, her blanched cheeks indicating her feelings, the court musicians halt when the merman's haunting harp music is heard in the hall. The melody pierces the king's heart, induces the prince to make a hasty exit, and because it imparts a sense of the page's presence, kills the princess. If this story is fairly conventional, the arresting visual design, which creates an unconventional vantage point within the picture frame, is more proleptic. Viewers are positioned just above the princess, looking down on her as she sinks to the floor surrounded by attendants, while a sartorially elegant server, his back and buttocks facing viewers, extends a glass of wine. The design, moreover, indicates several planes of action, almost several panels at once. The musicians at the back of the frame, whose interrupted performance alerts the king to trouble, the king, appropriately cut down to size, in the left middle ground, shouting while being ignored, and the hubbub in the foreground, where a beautiful attendant at the center reaches for the glass of wine to revive the princess who was already dead or dying. The artist's evident delight in the welter of textures and shapes of medieval fashions and fabrics, and his design's knowing perspectival inventiveness, anticipate neo-Victorian graphic texts that likewise borrow and visually riff upon Victorian material culture, as in the cover of the first number of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, for those of you who know that one. If the suffering princess of Ballad of the Page or the faithful waiting figure of Hinda in King Sigurd enforce conventional femininity, other poetic graphic texts of the 1860s adapt medieval women for feminist afterlives or as action heroes and villainesses that anticipate neo-Victorian novels and comics. Late in the 19th century, Joan of Arc became a familiar icon of militant suffragists, but already in November 1867, the same year that John Stuart Mill introduced the first bill for the women's franchise in Parliament, a poem of that title appeared in Cornhill magazine and demonstrated the liberatory possibilities of imagining a past, or reimagining a past, preceded by an epigraph from Schiller's Die Jungfrau von Orleans, in which Joan vows to undergo the sternest penance for having elevated herself above others. An italicized verse prologue makes explicit the work's fantasia on history. And this is the poet speaking. With 2 lines of German in my head, the poet shaped her afterlife in moody rhyme, in which, rather than being burned at the stake, Joan fled and lived in silent honor, nobly wed. The next page pictures the nobly wed Joan, pensive, eyes downcast, slightly frowning, garbed in a conical hat and veil, her long skirts flowing from a cinched waist, and necklace with a large cross. The image doubly signifies, through an initial impression born of stereotypes and a revised meaning, when the image is paired with the text. At first seeming to have effected the transformation of Joan from overweening woman warrior to conventional domestic wife, the image comes to signify imprisonment and frustrated rage instead. It is no coincidence that her hands occupy the same position as would the bound hands of a woman burned at the stake. Joan longs for the call of the trumpet, even the chain and stake, rather than her bondage. And this is her speaking in the poem. Oh God, is there worse pain in hell than this, to taste and loathe the quietness of bliss? It is not fame she misses, but famous deeds to do. Why am I kept idle? The text ends when her husband, overhearing her, exclaims upon the insatiable triad of God and any woman's heart and hell. She responds ironically, half smiling and lifting her head for a kiss. I go to give our maids their work, she said. They are insatiable of spinning wool. The penance announced in Schiller's lines in this reimagined past, is conventional marriage. Wise, usual confinement to the home. In using the past to comment on the present, in assuming women's fitness for heroic action, and above all, in self-consciously creating a fictional afterlife, Joan of Arc anticipates neo-Victorianism. Gender politics are subordinate to ambiguity and complex visuality in Rosamond, Queen of the Lombards, Frederick Sandy's striking drawing, which may be familiar to anyone who has visited the Fitzwilliam and Delaware art museums. Its title alludes to a medieval historical legend, which I recite as follows. According to tradition, Alboin, king of the Lombards, was assassinated by order of his wife Rosamond, whom he married following the death of Alboin's first wife, after he had forced Rosamond to follow the Lombard custom of drinking from the skull of her slain father. Viewed apart from the text, Sandy's design might seem to underscore the daughter, an unwilling sexual victim, since a contemplative Rosamond embraces her father's skull while kneeling before a crucifix illuminated by a lamp. A rosary depends from the stand holding the skull, which rests on a prie-dieu decorated with religious carvings, including what appears to be a crowned Virgin Mary. But Sandy's image acquires altered meanings when read as part of the Poetic-Graphic text in Once a Week in the 30 November 1861 issue. Not only does Rosamond, Queen of the Lombards, generate multiple, incoherent female identities that render femininity a hermeneutic problem rather than fixed essence, but it also anticipates elements of graphic fiction in its handling of visual spaces. In the Poetic-Graphic text, Rosamond herself does the killing after her captor, in addition to forcing her to drink from her father's skull, taunts her with being his sexual slave. Thy sire is rotting in his grave, thy sire, my beaten hound, and thou art but my layman slave, the whitest bosomed toy I have, my lady Rosamond. She raised the skull cup to her lips, queen-like she gazed around. Across her heart a shadow slips. Ah me, how sharp the memory grips of wild Lord Cunimund. Smiling, she touched it, bubbling fresh, like the broth of a wizard's charm. That night she caught him in her mesh and slew him, gorged with wine and flesh, with her ivory molded arm. Stanza 5 is unusual in its sexual explicitness, as is the poem, in making Rosamond both a fierce warrior, rather than mere plotter, and sexual victim. Combined with Sandy's representation of a pre-Raphaelite stunner, whose abundant curling hair and richly detailed surroundings recall D.G. Rossetti's St. Cecilia, which was an image for Tennyson's The Palace of Art in the 1857 Moxon edition, the Poetic-Graphic text looks ahead to the lethal but sexy comic book villainesses whose martial and physical powers threaten men even as their nubile bodies lure them on. Yet in murdering her captor, Rosamond also recalls the biblical heroine Judith, who commanded to enter the bed of Holofernes, decapitates him to save her city. Avenging her father's cruel murder and the dismembering of his body, Rosamond enacts an approved role as dutiful daughter. But whereas Judith commits murder before she is sexually violated and thus remains a pure woman, the once-a-week Rosamond is sexually experienced, hence a fallen woman. Indeed, the text aligns the white-bosomed toy with the ivory-molded arm that drives a knife into her captor's heart while in bed with him. Possibly, Sandys visualizes Rosamond just before she retires, as she embraces her father's remains in a space designated for prayer and steels herself to enter the drunken king's bed. But joined to the text, the image as readily represents Rosamond fresh from the murder. A dagger rests under a brazier, and even on the prie-dieu, sharp scissors, another potential murder weapon, are visible immediately beneath the skull. As with Burne-Jones's King Sigurd, Sandy's design can thus represent both a before and an after. And these multiple potential temporalities are complemented by a handling of space that approximates separate panels of action. The wall hanging that serves as backdrop to the crucifix separates divine from profane details to the left, where the king, drunk or dead, slouches on the bed, his wine cup and footstool overturned. Rosamond's magnificent hair complicates these divisions because it begins in sacred and then billows into profane space, perhaps registering her complex identity. Like Neo-Victorian works, then, this poetic-graphic text appropriates a past while opening up an array of female subjectivities and experiences that challenge any single view of womanhood. Possibly a new Victorian develop enabled the ambiguity of Rosamond, Queen of the Lombards, for it appeared around the same time that Lady Audley, another beautiful woman associated with Pre-Raphaelite art who was willing to kill to achieve her purposes, was enthralling audiences. And I'm referring here to Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret, which was serialized from 6 July to 28 September 1861, the same year as this poem. Two poetic-graphic texts of 1866 to 67 eschew the intriguing ambiguity of Rosamond, but prefigure heroic 20th century female action figures. In The Bride of Roselle, a Jersey legend, and The Huntress of Armorica, a tale of St. Michael's Mount, attractive women rescue the men they love through feats of physical daring. A legend, or tale, allowing for the counterfactual and implying a different past, enables such plots. The text of The Bride of Roselle tells of a new bride whose husband, absent while hunting a dragon, is reported dead when his friend returns. She complies with her husband's reported last wishes, sealed with his ring, that she wed the friend. But as soon as she completes the ceremony, she announces to her people that she will seek her husband, requiring their obedience to their new prince, with the caveat that if her pet bird returns, it is a sign that her lord still lives and that his friend is a traitor. Wending her way alone through the labyrinthine, monster-haunted forest where her husband lately hunted, she finds her wounded husband, releases her bird, and causes swift justice back home. The poem itself intervenes in conventional womanhood and earlier versions of the legend, as a footnote indicates, since the story usually ends with a woman's marriage to the successor or her first husband's return by supernatural means. Here, the bride's intrepid action is the engine of justice. But the accompanying illustration is equally crucial, for it shows her in full-length gown and veil, athletically grasping a bough to swing across a stream and aid her husband, who passively rests against a tree. The illustrator's choice to capture the bride amidst action as, quote, she seized a bough and slung herself to land, rather than after she lands, quote, on her knees at those dear feet, reinforces her power. The Huntress of Armorica is even more proleptic of modern common action heroines. The text opens, frankly celebrating a woman's physical prowess and daring do. Quote, tower lordly as thou wilt, rise bold to heaven, thou heaved up pyramid of Carrag Luz. And that's another name for St. Michael's Mount off Cornwall, if any of you have been there. No match art thou for a woman in her will. Strike with the terrors of thy granite bulk, the bondman gazing on thy spar-lit heights. Thou hauntest not, thou dauntest not, the huntress of the hills. She who hath scaled wild peaks to hunt the wolf in wide Armorica. Like Joan of Arc, the poem also celebrates women's rights just when votes for women were being discussed as part of the Second Reform Bill. Ian, niece to King Cathon, has been detained for refusing to marry her cousin, the king's heir. Summoned to the king's presence, she defies him again, the king explicitly censuring her as, quote, unmannered and unwomanly for daring to stand before him, quote, as if thou equal wert. He threatens that if she continues to resist his will, Mallow, the imprisoned man she loves, will be placed in a boat and pent in a sea cave until he starves. At this point, she demands her liberty, only to be told, quote, that is for man. And she answers, for woman too. O miserable man, that on the vigor and the might heaven gave for his self-use, himself will set the curb. Give me liberty, or take my life. Sounds kind of familiar to Americans, doesn't it? The king swiftly dispatches Mallow to the hollow cave with henchmen. But because she hunts, Ian knows of an outlet on the other side. She becomes an action heroine indeed, when she emerges atop the mount, armed body and soul, leaping from crag to crag, a shield behind her slung by two light paddles crossed like pirate flag, bearing its skull and fleshless bones aloft. Spying the boat holding her lover, who was bound hand and foot, she takes a daring leap into it, unlooses his hands, uses her shield to deflect arrows from the king's men as Mallow rose, then bade him bear the shield aloft, and in her stronger hands the paddles seized. Eventually they make their way to Armorica, present-day Brittany, and she nurses her lover back to health. Afterward, meeting him on the hills to carry the spoils of his hunting, and later still teaching her children how to scale the slopes with firm, free foot. Once more, the illustrator might have selected the concluding, more conventional moment for his design, that is, when she's happily married with children. Instead, the image presents Ian on the heights of St. Michael's Mount as she completes her daring leap, the shield and paddles slung behind her, her hair streaming, her arms bare, and her skirt billowing up to her knees to reveal her sandal-clad feet. More than any other poetic-graphic text I located, the Huntress of Armorica looks ahead to comics iconography. Ian is, for all purposes, a Victorian Wonder Woman. And the image was accorded greater prominence because, as an extra illustration in a Christmas season issue, it took the form of a full-page plate tipped in rather than placed on a page with surrounding text. Significantly, St. Michael's Mount was associated with Arthurian legend. The Huntress of Armorica reinscribes this famous landmark with female rather than male heroism. And since in the case of Tennyson's Idylls, past legend was being co-opted as a commentary and guide for the present, perhaps this poetic graphic text also had a contemporary application, particularly debates in the late 1860s over women who fox hunted and rode fast horses. If any of you have read Aurora Floyd by Mary Elizabeth Bratton, you may have run into these debates. The poetic graphic text devoted to Joan of Arc, Queen of the Lombards, the Bride of Roselle, and Ian the Huntress challenged the exclusive suitability of domestic roles for women, and together with other 1860s works noted above, demonstrated a self-conscious use and adaptability of neo-medievalism, which could shore up conservative masculinity and imperialism, or question masculine authority and the efficacy of middle-class female domesticity while re-embroidering or reinventing the past. The number of neo-medieval poetic graphic texts in the ProQuest database steeply declines after 1869, suggesting that a media vogue had largely run its course after Tennyson's 1869 Idylls. The 1870s work most proleptic of neo-Victorianism comes from Quiver, devoted to Sunday reading, in which Anui Lane adapts and repurposes Tennyson's neo-medieval characters as modern characters in revised narratives, here a religious one, And I just, for those of you who haven't read Sir Thomas Malory or Tennyson, that particular story is about Elaine, the lily maid, totally innocent, who is in her home when Lancelot, who's been wounded in a tournament while riding in disguise, comes to get healed. She nurses him. She recognizes valor and prowess, totally falls in love with him. But because he's already an adulterer and involved with Guinevere, he cannot break off from Guinevere, and he's called falsely true to his love. So that's what this particular little poem is playing on. The illustration depicts 4 women and a man in up-to-date dress lounging on an Isle of Wight hillside overlooking the sea. The text invokes a past reading of Tennyson's Idyll of Elaine, when among the reading group was Nellie, quote, "A lily maid indeed, to another falsely true." But though Nellie's story had then implied sorrow, this post-Tennysonian Elaine has a different ending. As the poem says, "Come back and read in Nellie's eyes the promise of a brighter life. The past may still be sad, and yet I think God helps us to forget." This adaptation of Tennyson serves the end of teaching religious consolation, but anticipates neo-Victorianism and self-consciously looking back to an earlier scene of reading and replaying it in a modern idiom, the two together forming a palimpsest. And it's also interesting it's set on the Isle of Wight, because here you see these modern characters instead of the Isle of Wight's most famous resident, who was Tennyson himself. In the 1880s, aside from a continuing spate of humorous cartoons, the most relevant poetic-graphic texts likewise suggest the emergence of nascent neo-Victorianism, especially two that involve palimpsestic spaces in which the old is also starkly modern and the now takes shape as and out of the past. Text and image are always inseparable in poetic-graphic texts, but they are unusually interdependent in King Gall in Leisure Hour, September 1887, which is the first periodical poem of W.B. Yeats. For the image is by Yeats's father, Jack Yeats, who depicts his son, the poet, as the Irish King Gall, his long hair tangled in the heartstrings, which he destroys in his frenzied singing. And just to explain the pretext, King Gall has gone out as a valorous king should when invaders threaten his kingdom, but in the process of killing and slaughtering people, he's so horrified it drives him mad. And he wanders around afterwards and finds a harp and takes it up and sings in his madness. The poet thus provides the words and also looks out at us from the image, his hands on the harp. Insofar as the harp tropes poetry itself, Yeats dominates the entire poetic-graphic work, asserting total identification with his text. Yet in another respect, Yeats is performing a filial role, submitting to representation mediated by his father. An intriguing meta-commentary on the affiliation and contested subordination and domination of word and image discussed by Lorraine Cuistre and others. Yeats's text seems highly self-aware of this, since it obliquely comments on the marriage of diverse media, harp, and human voice, while his parenthetical,
We moved ahead a couple.
sorry.
It's okay.
It's this one. I'm so sorry. I can't always see these. Thank you. Yeats's text seems highly aware of all this, since he refers to both harp music and human voice as paired, while his parenthetical refrain not only introduces an uncanny note, but also registers multiple voices and perspectives. Of some unhuman misery are married voices wildly trolled. They will not hush, the leaves that ran me flutter, the beech leaves old. And this is a refrain that indicates his madness. Have you all had time now to look at this image? Okay, thank you. The Yeats poetic-graphic text, with its tacit generational context, allots roughly equal space to text and image. In a Tennysonian study in London Society in July 1885, the image dominates text by the Victorian poet laureate, so that in spatial terms, Tennyson already seems superseded. Yet the image also realizes what Tennyson had imagined in The Princess, his neo-medieval poem of 1847. At the bottom of the page, 6 lines by Tennyson express Lilia's fantasy of being some great princess who built far off from men a college like a man's, where I would teach them all that men are taught, in the poem. And in 6 other lines, a masculine narrator, as in Tennyson's poem, subordinates women to roles as objects of the gaze, saying how pretty were the sight if our old halls could change their sex and show sweet girl graduates in their golden hair. The textual excerpts effectively restage the battle of the sexes and call attention to historical fantasy and projection in Tennyson's 1847 poem, in which Victorian contemporaries look back to an imagined past in order to look forward to an altered footing between the sexes while glancing anxiously at the present. Artist Frank Goddard, in turn, reaches back to a mid-Victorian poem to illustrate Lilia's desire, yet crafts an image that enacts its distinctive modernity. Since by 1885, women university students wandered amidst neo-medieval buildings designed by Alfred Waterhouse at Girton College. Tennyson is displaced by the Tennysonian, for only the title indirectly acknowledges his authorship, whereas the artist engraver enjoys double signature and his image dominates the page. As with so many neo-Victorian texts, a Tennysonian study glances toward and briefly dips into a Victorian text, but mainly circulates arch modernity through newly revised Victorianism. Neo-medievalism remained an important, if less frequent, reference point at century's end in the Holy Grail tapestries of Edward Burne-Jones and Aubrey Beardsley's illustration of the J.M. Dent serial issue of Mallory's Morte d'Arthur in 1893 and 94. This is actually my image from our copy of the original serial parts of this publication in our special collections. I don't know, Sarah, if you got to see this while you were there or not. Okay. However, a canonical Victorian poet and an artist identified with decadence together created a poetic-graphic text that can be said to mark the birth of neo-Victorianism as we know it, an echo from Willowwood, with text by Christina Rossetti and designs by Charles Ricketts. For this hybrid text explicitly quotes and replays in a different register the visual and verbal works of D.G. Rossetti. The text is doubly belated since its title announces an aftersound or echo, while the poet's last name identifies the surviving sister of D.G. Rossetti, whose line forms the sonnet's epigraph and a legend on the visual border between Ricketts' 2 images, O ye, all ye that walk in Willowwood. In D.G. Rossetti's Willowwood sonnets, also first published in a periodical, a bereaved lover sits beside a spring with love personified, and as love strums a lute and sweeps the water with his wing, the face of the lost beloved rises to the surface, the lover's lips meeting hers for a long kiss that lasts only so long as love sings. In the sister's echo, the woman is no longer a ghostly phantom rising to the water's surface, but an equal sharer of gazing, longing, and loss. 2 gazed into a pool. He gazed and she, each eyed the other's aspect, she and he, each felt one hungering heart leap up and sink. Everywhere true to the tone, theme, and formal choices of the Willowwood sonnets, the echoing text also revises the former in making the woman an active agent and participant, a decidedly modern note in 1890. Rickett's design also looks back to, yet revises, his precursor's art. The upper half of the diptych is clearly indebted to D.G. Rossetti, as Lorraine Coistre notes, in its crowded visual scene, neo-medieval trappings, and frame that pays homage to D.G. Rossetti's own visual designs for his books. The shells on the bereaved man's cape also recall decorative devices on the frames of Rossetti's paintings, while the empty boat perhaps alludes to Rossetti's Moxon illustration for the Lady of Shalott. In contrast, Rickett's second image, beautifully attuned to swirling water that joins the lovers' faces in Christina Rossetti's text, shifts to an Art Nouveau style, while also graphically marking, as Coistre notes, the sonnet's division between octave and sestep. In paying such homage to D.G. Rossetti and his verbal visual idioms, then sweeping away from them in both text and design, thus marking the temporal distance of this 1890 work from them, this poetic-graphic text establishes the very groundwork of later neo-Victorianism, adapting Victorianism to circulate modernity and difference. Now I have one last one, which comes from 1910. And what I'm doing with this particular poem is showing how in this neo-medieval image, you get a kind of anticipation of neo-medievalism in the 20th century used to conservative ends, just as Margaret Thatcher, who proudly identified herself as a conservative, revived the Victorian values of thrift and hard work. And that's one of the forms of neo-Victorianism some contemporary histories of that idiom like to talk about. So in Proud Princess, I'm going to hurry through this since we're getting kind of short. No? Are we okay on time? Okay. All right. Then it's not very much longer. Proud Princess initially suggests mid-Victorian feminism as well as 1860s neo-medieval visuality in its headpiece representing the princess in splendid isolation, just as the text at first represents a woman impervious to marriage. Against her jeweled throne she leant, more pale than driven snow, and suitors came and suitors went, but proud princess said no. All changes when, instead of offering her agency as a co-ruler or proposing the strategic advantage of adjoining kingdoms, the last suitor declares, I want a wife. The princess's cheek glows, her eyes soften, and she smiles as he continues, a simple woman she must be, my heart of hearts her home, my laughing children round her knee. In the work's final image, and there is an interim image where you actually see a rejected suitor despondently walking away from her throne. So in this final image, the suitor may be on bended knee, but the princess has risen from her throne and is delivering herself into his arms, and the text announces the sequel. He leapt to his feet like an arrow darts as she swayed in her silken dress. Then he clasped her to his heart of hearts, for proud princess said, yes. Possibly this graphic text had been accepted months earlier, but it was published less than 2 weeks after Black Friday, which was 18 November 1910, when 300 suffragists demonstrating against Prime Minister Asquith, who had prevented a partial suffrage bill from coming to a vote, rushed the House of Commons and violence ensued. The self-subordination of a woman of power in Proud Princess to normative mid-Victorian domesticity gains greater legibility if read as a recuperation of neo-medievalism to insist on conservative gender roles and social policies. As this selective survey of neo-medieval poetic-graphic texts from 1860 to 1910 indicates, the relation among Victorian poetic-graphic texts, contemporary neo-Victorianism, and 20th and 21st century comic book art is palimpsestic. Though it is unlikely that creators of comic book superheroines knew or took direct inspiration from the Huntress of Armorica, and though few, if any, scholars of Neo-Victorianism have cited an echo from Willowwood as a nodal point in the field's emergence, this partial exploration of the immense archive of Victorian illustrated poems and periodicals from 1860 to 1910 reveals antecedents for a wide range of Neo-Victorian practices and comic book conventions. In addition to embodying temporal complexity and self-conscious imaginings of the past that imbricate the past and modern preoccupations, these neo-medieval texts, like neo-Victorian works, also offer complex representations of gender and sexuality. Bringing awareness of neo-Victorian work to the study of Victorian poetic-graphic texts in turn offers the opportunity to reread older productions as hybrid texts. In them, inseparable images and words create complex meanings and also allure us to the disputed ground or social fissures underlying this Victorian body of work, as well as the conservative ends to which they could be put, a prefiguring of future pasts, indeed. So, thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.